Still a few more. Yeah? Hi, folks, and thanks for coming in today. I'm Howard Green from BNN, and this panel is Powering Asia's Rise, Opportunities and Challenges for Canadian Energy Producers. And with that in mind, I think I'll just throw the cat among the pigeons right away here, so to speak. Last week, as many of you know, Jeff Rubin, who was a celebrated Bay Street economist at CIBC, and former hockey star Scott Niedermayer joined the list of people who are against Northern Gateway. And Jeff was actually on my show last week, and he referred to the oil sands as the tar sands. And he says he supports the tar sands, but not Northern Gateway. It's an interesting choice of language. And although Northern Gateway is not the central subject today, it is under that umbrella topic that we want to talk about, Powering Asia's Rise. It's very easy to forget how blessed we are as a nation as far as our energy resources go. And it's easy to take for granted what a beautiful country it is. At the same time, our biggest customer is showing resistance to some of our projects, our infrastructure projects, and also rapidly developing its own energy through shale gas. At the same time as that, there are clearly customers for everything that we have. So the questions become, who should we sell it to? How much should we sell? How should we get it to them? And how can we maximize what we have for the benefit of all Canadians and also minimize any possible harm? Obviously, the big questions are stark, but there are many subtleties in between, and I hope that we can delve into some of those in our discussion today. And let me introduce our panelists. Brian Ferguson, to my immediate right, is the president and CEO of Cenovus Energy, with operations in Alberta's oil sands as well as natural gas and crude oil production in Alberta and Saskatchewan. To my immediate left, Dave Porter, Chief Executive Officer of the BC First Nations Energy and Mining Council. He's the former Deputy Premier of the Yukon as well, and was also Assistant Deputy Minister of Aboriginal Affairs for the BC government. Dr. Wenran Jiang, the far end there on the right, is a special advisor to the Alberta Department of Energy on Asian market diversification and a senior fellow of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And then on my left at the far end, Kevin Lynch, Vice Chair of BMO Financial Group and former Deputy Minister of Finance and Industry and also former Clerk of the Privy Council. Just an esteemed group for sure. So, Brian, because you're the producer on the panel, if I might throw the first question to you, given what Jeff Rubin and Scott Niedermayer said last week, what their message is, what's your key message here today?
Well, first I'm curious whether I was one of the cat or the pigeon in the initial.
It's a broad metaphor.
Okay, and let me move to your second question. Our view is that we need all the market access that we can get in Canada, whether that is to the East Coast, whether that is south, or whether that is to the West Coast. One of the things that tends to get forgotten, for example, about West Coast access, is that also means that Canadian crude could get down to California, for example. It isn't just about this being potentially able to be exported to Asia. We have a very significant investment opportunity, development opportunity here for Canada. It isn't just in the oil sands. You mentioned conventional oil. We've had a significant increase here in Canada in our conventional oil production, in the tight oils. So there's a very significant opportunity here. There's a very significant opportunity in natural gas as well. So, through LNG exports on the West Coast, for example, as well. We're also at the point here in North America, given the advances in technology and innovation developments we've seen in the United States. And last year was the first year where the U.S. oil production actually increased as well. Take a look at what's developed in the U.S. in terms of shale gas. So if you start to think about and recognize that Canada is not an island, we operate and we live in a global economy, and we operate and function very importantly in a North American context as well. I think we're at the cusp where, for example, North America could become an energy exporter. When you think about all the resource that we have on natural gas, with a third largest oil resource here in the oil sands, what we've developed in terms of conventional oil. So I think there's a real change in paradigm and mindset that people could take. I absolutely agree with the observation that there are many challenges that we need to address in terms of resource development, whether that's on the environmental front, and I think that that's one of the things as Canadians that we should really be proud of, is how our resource is being developed. We are operating in one of the most stringent regulatory environments of anywhere in the world in terms of the development of natural resources, not just oil, not just gas, all of our natural resources, the transparency with which we have to operate on. You just try to go to any other country in the world that's a major oil or gas producer, and I would challenge you to see the transparency in their production, their environmental performance that we see here. And importantly, too, we have to take into consideration all of the impact and the benefits to all of our stakeholders as well. So, it's something that it's a resource, it's a tremendous opportunity here. Thinking about that closing slide that was up, is Asia an opportunity or a threat? Well, I certainly am in the camp where it is much more an opportunity than it is a threat. And Canada, I believe, is ideally positioned to take advantage of that.
Dave, your key message?
Well, first of all, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. And as well, I would like to thank Mr. Manley and the CEOs for the invitation to come here and speak today. And as well to thank them for the release of their timely report, which talks about toward a national energy strategy. And Section 8 of that report talks about the need to engage First Nations in this discussion and to ensure that First Nations are part of the planning process, a part of the decision-making process, and as well are beneficiaries for any large-scale economic development such as being proposed for the west coast of British Columbia today. And I think that my key message today is exactly what that report recommends, that governments and industry must respect the rights of Aboriginal people in British Columbia, and that there has to be not only a consultation process to engage us in the discussion, but there has to be an accommodation of our interests. And what does that mean on a government-to-government basis? That means, from my perspective, that there has to be resource revenue sharing occurring between our governments and public governments in this country. If you read the last report of the outgoing Auditor General, Sheila Fraser, she says, despite the fact that we live in one of the most richest countries in the world with one of the highest standards of living, the condition of Aboriginal people in this country is getting worse. It's not getting better. And we heard today that China has pulled 300 million people out of poverty into the middle class, while Canada has not enjoyed that kind of success. Of the over 1 million Aboriginal people in this country, we still live in abject poverty. And so one way that we have to address that when we talk about this phenomenal opportunity for investment from other countries into this country to exploit the resource base, then one of the key drivers has to be a conversation about public governments sharing those revenues. And that includes Alberta, by the way. And I think that the other message to industry is that we have to sit down and we have to negotiate on a respectful basis, and we have to share in the profits that industry takes from these lands and resources. Not only should we be talking about training, jobs, protection of the environment, equity opportunities, but I think now is the time for profit-sharing discussions to occur with industry as well.
Wenran?
Well, it looks like listening to our colleagues, the part on our panel discussion here, the opportunities side is being well defined with all the slides. You've been to different conferences. But I think more on the challenges that we're facing. And the challenges not seem to be how we go up to, Asian market, is on how we deal with, how we engage China, how we engage Asia. And by the way, I would rather speak under my hat of being an academic. I don't represent Alberta government at all. But the Department of Energy in Alberta does have a new unit for international energy policy. They're reaching out with the private sector, with the federal government, with the Chinese Asian side, even with Aboriginal people, together with BC. They realize the importance of that. So what I see on the challenge side for our engagement with Asia, with China, is really part of the debate is, I think we just don't have a lot of good information and knowledge about China and about Asia. So that
what
limits,
kind of information?
I think we just don't know the dynamics enough about that part of the world. Let me give you an example. The current most heated debate is the state-owned enterprises or NOCs, whether they can CNOOC can buy Nexen or not. The current discussion, the debate on Nexen deal, and the broader discussion on the necessity for this country's energy diversification to Asian market is extremely limited. We're consumed by a lot of misinformation. We're consumed by a lot of stuff that we actually do not know very well. And the problem now is we feel insecure. And I think we have to go beyond that as a part of this reorientation of the national conversation. Everybody knows opportunities are there. I mean, Brian mentioned this earlier. We see Dominic's PowerPoints. We see all these opportunities there is being rationally defined, what I call based on the logic of the market. There is opportunity there. We have limited opportunity with U.S. market. There is price gaps on both oil and gas. And therefore, we need infrastructure. In order to do infrastructure, we have the gateway and others. We have to speed up the regulations. But the question is, does it convince the people who are not convinced? Just solely based on the logic of the market. We're not discussing the issues. Brian, you mentioned the Canadians are good at efficiency, environmental standards. Are we having that as a part of our engagement with China? We have common goals on environmental protection. Can we make it as a part of the deal in engaging China? Can we look at China's energy mix at the moment, 70% coming out of burning of the coal? Can we do something, say, some of our oil exports, potentially LNG exports, even the good quality coal exports out of, tech resources, export a lot of good quality coal. Can we use all these fossil fuels that they are to replace the bad quality coals in China, to replace coal usage in China on a massive scale, and take care of taking care of the CO2 emissions? These are totally missing in our conversation in terms of environment. And of course, there's other bigger issues of China's rise and how we engage China. We're afraid of China taking over Canada of this form or that form. But we also have to realize, when the Chinese putting in tens of billions of dollars in our economy, in our energy sector, and not really getting much of oil at all, they're taking the risk as well. And there are things in our engagement with the Chinese corporate sector that we can influence the directions of China's positive engagement in the global community to come to invest in Canada in the places that's transparent, rule-based, and tax revenues can be channeled very, very clearly to the benefit of the citizens. So if we drive Chinese investment away, not here, not in Australia, not in the United States, like the society that's rule-based, market-based principles, do we wish China to go to places like Iran, to go to Venezuela, to go to Sudan or Zimbabwe and Congo and all those places which do not have very clear rules, and they have trouble there themselves. So these are the questions I think we need to think beyond our backyard, beyond our communities, beyond our provincial borders and national borders.
Kevin, I want to get your key message, and then we'll go back and start following up on all of these things.
Hey, thank you. I want to go back almost to the context that Dominic was setting out for us at the start of the session. And Brian, you picked up on this a little bit. Is that we're in a profoundly changing kind of world. I mean, we're at a pivot point, and they're game-changing choices that we're going to make or not make in the next little while. You know, the rise in Asia and the numbers that Dominic put up, I mean, that's a reality, and that's the world that's going to exist. And if you think about in the energy thing, I mean, in many ways, there are two unconventional things happening. The International Energy Agency forecasts the demand for energy, oil and gas, it's going to grow by about 33% over the next kind of while to 2035. The unconventional thing is most of that demand growth is going to come in the non-OECD countries. In the last 50 or 60 years, it came in the OECD countries. That's a game changer. And that's partially China, but it's elsewhere. And so there's a huge sea change in where demand for energy is going to come from. We're a net exporter of energy. That really matters to us. The other unconventional thing is there's been a sea change in where actually energy is coming from. The rise of the unconventional, frack gas in the United States, oil sands and others. I mean, there's a huge supply now of natural gas in North America. Canada has great capacity to produce kind of more. So there's a changing in the supply of that. The other thing is our market for oil and gas is 100% the United States. 100% of our exports go for oil and gas to the United States. Over the next 20 years, the U.S. is actually going to plateau in its demand for energy, and its imports are going to decline. So from a Canadian perspective, we have to worry about security of demand. We have capacity to increase our supply quite a bit, but our only market that we have now is probably going to be buying less, not more. And therefore, for Canada, there's an enormous opportunity, and it's in the non-OECD countries, but to realize that opportunity, we actually have to have the capacity to access those markets. And I think that's both the opportunity and the challenge going ahead.
You know, taking all of those points, Brian, if I can go back to you, and I don't mean to harp on what I started with at the outset, but how does your industry win the public trust of people like Jeff Rubin and Scott Niedermayer now?
Well, I've had the opportunity to host numerous business leaders, numerous political leaders, other various groups. You know, many of my colleagues here in the room took the opportunity to come up and actually see the oil sands firsthand this past April. I have yet to meet anyone who's actually taken the time to come and see what we're doing and how we're doing it, who doesn't come away with a changed opinion and a positive opinion.
But 34 million people can't go.
You're correct. 34 million people can't go. But if we get people that are decision makers, that are opinion leaders, to ensure that they themselves are informed, first and foremost, with the facts, then I think that's a starting point. One of the things that we are certainly doing as an industry is we are really ramping up in terms of trying to communicate that information. You've seen communication, advertisements in various forms, and trying to really indicate what it is, how we're doing, not on the environmental side, but not just on the environmental side. Looking at this in a more holistic perspective in terms of, if we're going to have a conversation about the environment, we also need to talk about the economy, we need to talk about energy as well. One of the things that it comes back here, Asia, you've got over 3 billion people who aspire to the standard of living that we have here in North America. What's the one thing that is absolutely fundamental to their progress, the growth of their middle class? It's energy and access to energy. That's one of the big advantages that we have here in Canada, is we have that opportunity we have what the world needs today. In terms of changing, and I wouldn't say changing people's opinions, we want to inform people. There's been a number of surveys that have been done, and the majority of Canadians are actually believe that what we're doing in terms of resource development, whether it's in mining, whether it's in the oil sands, whether it's in conventional oil, believe that it is being done in a responsible fashion. So I don't think there's, the majority of people already believe that. And as I said earlier, and with the risk of being repetitive, we operate in one of the most stringent regulatory environments anywhere in the world in terms of resource development here in Canada. And that's something that the average Canadian needs to understand, and we should be proud of, too, about how we develop those resources.
So Dave, let me follow up with you on that point. I mean, are you and your organization and the people you represent happy with the way resources are developed in this country?
Absolutely not, because we're not benefiting from any of the resource development in any significant way. There's been times of boom and bust because we're very much of an extractive-driven economy for the resource base. And First Nations in this country have seen very little benefit.
But what about from the transparency point of view that Brian was talking about before, as a separate issue from revenues?
A separate issue from revenues? Well, the other issue is profit sharing, right? I talked about that as well. And we'd like to hear industry on that point. Are they prepared to sit down with us and ensure that we receive a fair allocation from the profits that they take from the exploitation of the resources?
And what about from an environmental point of view?
Well, on the question of the environmental assessment review process, I'm not going to spend a heck of a lot of time criticizing the government, but one of the things the government did not do is to engage us in that conversation. We went through an analysis of the EA process here in British Columbia, and we brought forward a proposal. And basically the proposal called for a tripartite discussion between the province, the federal government, and ourselves. That discussion did not happen. There were some discussions on a bilateral basis between the two public governments, and at the end of the day, it was Ottawa knows best, and we're going to make the changes unilaterally despite what you may feel. And so now what's going to happen is that people are going to look at Bill C-38, and they're going to look at how the heck can we gum up the process? How can we litigate effectively to challenge these changes that have been made? Supposedly the changes were made because, we're all foaming at the mouth radicals up in British Columbia, all of us, right? The whole province. And so therefore, we can't be dealt with on a respectful basis and included in the conversation. And we can change that. I think the saving measure in all of this is that the EA process, as I understand it, allows for delegation of responsibility for the process. In other words, I understand that the idea is that there could be one project, one review process. And so I think we have no choice but to turn our attention to a conversation with the provincial government and say, let's attempt to build a process in British Columbia that is inclusive of the interests of BC. And then should we find that acceptable model, then presumably we take down that delegation and ask for that delegation from the federal government to have an effective process from our perspective.
I want to put up a couple of slides, just change direction a little bit here. If we can get 5, 6, and 7 ready, and I'll go through those. Number 5, there it is. 7 in 10, this is from Ipsos, 7 in 10 Canadians say our energy and resource sectors will benefit greatly from better access to Asian markets. Let's have 6 as well. Okay, there it is. 9 in 10 Canadians agree Canada needs non-U.S. markets for our energy and resources. Okay, now let's put up 7. 3/4 of Canadians worry that more foreign ownership will cause Canada to lose control of its natural resources. So Wenran, let me throw that to you. I mean, we've got an internal conflict brewing there, obviously, between those, particularly that last one compared to the first two. How do we reconcile that?
Well, the interest for non-U.S. market is obvious now. People got it in the past couple of years. This last slide clearly shows our internal struggle and tension on how we deal with the potential Asian, especially Chinese investment. Obviously, if you look at in the past 3 years, since late 2009, the two-country relations warmed up. You got about 8 or 9 large deals. China alone has put in about $16 billion. If we have Nexen deal and the $1.5 billion sale of Talisman's North Sea asset to Sinopec goes through, it will instantly double the Chinese investment in Canada. So the worry is understandable but not well-founded. Okay, as the Chinese ambassador, I was interested in reading the Global Mail, as we all did. He gave a very candid interview, and he basically said, look, Chinese investment in Canada, total 2%, is not something that's worth to be alarming about, okay? This is traditionally, yes, we have Americans, Europeans investing in this country. Our resources are always being invested by foreign FDI, and that's the reality. The difference is now we're seeing a shift from traditional European and North American investors to Asian ones. And we traditionally know Americans well, like it or not. This is the devil that we know. But the China is the one that we don't know. I think that's the worry.
What's the difference between Potash Corporation and Nexen? What's the difference between Potash Corporation and Nexen?
Well, Potash would be representing a substantial portion of Canadians' one sectoral asset, whereas Nexen has $15 billion, 28% of that asset located in Canada. If you look at Petronas taking over Progress, that $5.5 billion deal, that deal is bigger than the portion of Nexen's Canadian assets. So you have to put things in perspective. If China is coming in with Sinopec, CNPC, CNOOC, and saying we're putting a consortium to invest and buy Nexen, Talisman, Canadian Resources, Cenovus, all those 4 or 5 large ones combined, I think that is worth a national debate. At the moment, it is really crying wolf for very little things we're looking at. Our transactions, both in investment and trade, is at a very infant stage. So at this level, we're sounding alarm. And I think fundamentally, let me put it that way, we need to ask ourselves a question. Are we treating China as a business partner, if not as a friend? Are we treating them as a business partner, or we're treating it as an enemy? If you read what our intelligence security agency CSIS putting out on the reports, on the latest warnings, the assumption that China is our enemy, anybody getting closer to China is to help the enemy. That mentality is not going to help. So I think if there are national security issues, we need to deal with it. We need to identify it. But you can't just let this out and saying somehow we have to assume China is our enemy, and therefore everything we do, we have to guard as if we're dealing with an enemy. And if everything Chinese do in this country would be the enemy trying to take over us, that mentality is not going to work.
So, Kevin, you've got the public policy background here in spades. There's a lot of things we're talking about here, obviously. But, and I know in your capacity at BMO, I think you guys advised Nexen, so I won't put you in that position to ask you about that. But in terms of getting what Brian produces out to the West Coast in a way that would satisfy Dave and his constituency and other Canadians, like the Jeff Rubins and Niedermeyers, how do you do it from a public policy point of view?
Let me just on 5 and 6 first.
Okay, sure.
I'll come to,
all right.
I think it's actually reassuring that Canadians understand how big the diversification that we need to do kind of is. I mean, in many ways, you think about what Dominic was saying to us a little while back, it's very similar to the debates that we were having in Canada in the mid-'80s, when we actually pivoted through a free trade agreement with the United States. We're now talking about the next big pivot is how do we move a substantial proportion of our kind of trade, not just in natural resources. I think Dominic was saying there's a huge middle class in emerging Asia that Canadian firms can sell to as well. So that's a big change. The seventh one, frankly, Canada has worried about foreign direct investment for a long period of time. But Canada also needs foreign direct investment to finance and develop its assets. And that's always been the case, and it will continue. The interesting thing is, Canada, compared to 30, 40 years back when we worried about American foreign direct investment, Canada is now both a big investor abroad and a big recipient of investment here. And that builds supply chains and networks around the world. And that's actually part of the reason why we're as successful as we are.
But let me just follow up before I get back to that other question. I mean, if you're sitting in government here and a bid comes in like Wenran described, for a whole bunch of these companies, or say Steve Williams' company right there, Suncor. I mean, Hal Quisley, I think, said on our channel last week, Suncor is off limits. Do you know that?
We have the Petro-Canada Act there, but I think it's irrelevant in a sense.
It's irrelevant? Yeah? Is it irrelevant?
Well, let me go back. You were going to actually let me off the hook on this, but I mean, the fundamental point is we need foreign direct investment to develop our kind of our assets. And as Wenran said, the Nexen portion of the production of oil and gas in Canada is relatively small. But this investment will allow the development of the oil. If you go back to what Mark Carney was saying, part of our ability to grow and create more wealth is to expand our natural resources to emerge. Unless we produce more, we're not going to realize that economic gain in terms of standard of living. You can debate about how you allocate it, but if we actually don't grow the pie, we're not going to have the ability to, in a sense, talk about how we distribute the pie. So I think we need a growth strategy, and that's got to be a diversification strategy. And the only way we can diversify to these new markets is to have the transportation infrastructure to get there, because natural resources without markets or access to them are not as valuable as they are with access to them.
And that I'll get back to that transportation infrastructure, but Dave, go ahead.
I have a solution.
Yeah?
We can take the gas, freeze the ocean, and then take the bitumen and make hockey pucks and meet them and shoot them across.
Okay, we'll take a note of that and propose it to him. But, let me just come to you more seriously. I know you don't want to talk about Northern Gateway, but you are a fan, if I can put it that way, of Kinder Morgan's approach, whereas you are not a fan of that other company.
Well, first of all, let me
why?
say the policy of the gateway strategy of accessing Asian markets is a solid one. It makes a lot of sense, right? For us to be captive to one market just does not make business sense.
So everybody agrees on that, I think. Here, all four of you. Okay.
Sure. We all, I think, agree on that question. With respect to the specific proposal of Enbridge, they screwed up right from the beginning and have never been able to recover. Their relationship, their entree into the communities was a disaster right from the get-go. And so they built up a very adversarial relationship with the Aboriginal leadership. And I've witnessed firsthand some of that activity.
Unfortunately, they're not here to defend themselves.
Well, it doesn't make a difference. So bring them on. And with respect to Ian Anderson's approach...
That's Kinder Morgan.
The CEO of Kinder Morgan. He's struck a very different tone.
In what way? Like, what's the secret
I sat
sauce?
with him at the Vancouver Board of Trade, and his approach was, I'm not going to send a bunch of incompetent consultants out there to engage in a discussion with the chiefs. He said, that's my job. I'm the head of this company, and I'm going to talk to every chief along the right-of-way, and I'm going to find out for myself what are the issues and strike that relationship. And so the approach it's kind of remind me of Bob Blair when he won the big pipeline debate in northern Canada, because he took on the big guys, and that was his approach. Very very direct, very honest, and very respectful of the local communities. And so I think there is a real contrast between the two. And so I think that in terms of the Enbridge proposal, clearly there's not much daylight there in terms of it ever becoming reality. I think that the company has a lot of responsibility for that situation. And I think the environmental assessment review terms of reference don't even address the question of tanker traffic, which a lot of people are concerned about. So from a British Columbia perspective, we're being asked to take all of the risk, and very little of the benefit is going to accrue to the people of British Columbia. And I can tell you that from my conversations with the chiefs, they are not convinced that this can be done in an environmentally sustainable fashion. And there's a lot of conversations to be had on a whole number of issues related to these projects. But I'd also like to say that it's different on gas. Right now we have 5 LNG proposals in British Columbia. The legislature in Victoria just recently passed legislation to allow for provincial regulations to apply on the Haisla Reserve to accommodate LNG plants to be constructed. And then that was followed up with an agreement between the province and the Haisla First Nation for a transfer of lands from public land status to First Nations fee simple ownership to accommodate additional expansion of LNG. And Apache and Canna and EOG on their proposed line to Kitimat have the First Nations as equity partners in that line. So we're seeing, I think, really different approaches on gas and very different approaches in terms of competing oil companies. And guys like TransCanada, the CEO just invited me to spend a day with their senior team in Kananaskis, and he's asking me, how can we do a better job in the Aboriginal communities? And I think more CEOs should join in that conversation and talk to Sean Atleo, talk to our leadership, and start forging relationships and start creating the conversation and establishing a mutually agreeable agenda. And then once we've figured it out between industry and the Aboriginal leadership of this country, then at that juncture, I think we invite the federal government to the table. We can't invite them too early because they're going to screw things up.
Have you got some fresh ideas to follow on here?
There's
for the industry.
Distinctly some interesting thoughts. There, a couple of things that I'd observe is that, in fact, in 2011, so our last fiscal year, about 10% of our capital spend was with Aboriginal companies. So there was a significant economic activity that's undertaken with Aboriginal companies by my company. I know industry as a whole is well above $1 billion in terms of direct investment and spend with Aboriginal contractors, Aboriginal companies. So there certainly is an ongoing partnership and business relationship today with a great number of Aboriginal companies. And one of the things we absolutely realize in industry is that all stakeholders, so it is absolutely Aboriginals, but it's all stakeholders in all communities, should feel and believe that they're better off because we're doing business in those communities. And that is the approach that industry takes.
Howard, can I just briefly follow on that? 2 points. At the micro level, I think what Dave, you're saying is it's wonderful. Actually, this is consistent to our conversations with Grand Chief Ed John in the past couple of years, other Aboriginal communities from BC. You're not fundamentally against shaping oil or Northern Gateway or so on and so forth. You're saying it's more than the money that matters, is the attitude. So on the Northern Gateway, I wanted to, maybe we can talk further. I like the idea you proposed about the federal, provincial, and the Aboriginal, and together, our private sector. Let's have that conversation, and have that conversation as a process, either parallel with the regulatory approval process or as a consultation process. I think that social licensing, the softened part of that, is important. So my approach to this, observing as an academic, I look for solutions. The solution now, if Enbridge has gone wrong, according to your opinion, they may have a different opinion, we need to resolve that. If we need to redesign the routes, if they have to restart again, if the senior executives have to come to learn a page from TransCanada or Ian Anderson, wonderful guy, let them do it. Can you give them an opportunity? I'll leave it to you to think about. But on the broader question of infrastructure, there's more than Northern Gateway. Okay, we have to look at other routes. I mean, Kinder Morgan is trying to propose to double the line. Of course, there will be opposition issues, but according to you, probably less. We have the pipeline on rail options are being pursued. East-west is being shaped quietly, maybe expanding further. The Alberta government is looking into this. And then there's Eddie Goldenberg now sitting here, have written about the eastern routes. We may divert line, reverse some line to export to east. So I think the market diversification to Asian routes could be using multiple channels rather than focusing on debate of the Enbridge Gateway alone. I think there's a bigger diversification issue if we look at the topic of today, right? I mean, we do have challenges, but the broader picture we need to look at very comprehensively.
But that conversation has to happen now. We can't wait until the panel makes its recommendations, and then it's in the hands of the cabinet to make a decision one way or another, right? We're almost 2 years, or less than 2 years out before that process concludes. So if there is to be conversation, we got to start that conversation now.
Yeah.
You know, on that, I want to come back to you, Kevin, because it was the question I had asked you before I took us in some other directions. But from a public policy point of view, the solution to the transportation infrastructure issue you've written about in Policy Options, the so-called public energy transportation corridor. Explain what it is. Paint a picture of it, conceptually.
Sure. And the rationale here a little bit, and this is what we have to decide as a country. Is this pivot to Asia and the need to get our resources kind of there, and not just natural resources, a broader base, and get SMEs involved. Is it such a major change that it invokes the national interest, not just private interests, or is it incremental and it can be handled by private? That's a big difference. I think it's of a magnitude and in a time frame that it is in the national interest of Canada. And we've done that before. When we've actually built our north-south lines, that was a public-private partnership because it was in Canada's interest to do it. The St. Lawrence Seaway, that actually was in the national. So I think the question is this just a series of private-led projects, or is it something Canada needs to get its mind around and whole? And I think if you read the work that the CCCE has done, talking about an energy framework and what have you, that's really saying there's a national interest here, and we need to look at it in a more holistic, strategic way, which I happen to agree with. And there are going to be trade-offs. Not everybody is going to agree, but you need that broader discussion, or else you can get bogged down in these. And we have to make sure that we don't default to not making decisions, because we have competitors in all this. We're not the only people that can supply gas and oil to Asia. Australia can do it. Russia can do it. We could have exports off the west coast of the United States. So we have to, I think, have a Canadian approach to this, invoke the kind of public interest, involve the different players. Not everyone's going to have a veto, but I think there has to be more of an inclusive, analytic, respectful national debate about kind of the benefit, if we think it's as important as I think it is. In that kind of environment, one could potentially look at, and this is just one sort of option, but I think we have to, think beyond kind of what we're necessarily just looking at now. One would be looking at a kind of public energy transportation corridor, which would be, in a way, mandated by governments. It would set environmental standards and remediation, which worry a lot of people. It would have views on revenue kind of sharing, but it would probably RFP to individual firms to do it. But in doing so, if they decided to kind of build and operate, they would have relative certainty about the environment going ahead. And so, in fact, one of the problems now is we're generating more uncertainty rather than certainty. The one certainty is the opportunity is there. The uncertainty is how quickly and how efficiently we're actually going to realize that opportunity. And that's not necessarily good for all Canadians.
Would you support that kind of a national project? A public energy transportation corridor that was mandated federally but was operated privately?
I think there's been agreement. You got it. You've asked the question earlier here. It's not a question of whether or not resources should be developed. It's how those resources should be developed. That seems to be the fundamental question here. And I think you're absolutely right to let's talk about this in a more strategic perspective as opposed to getting focused on one very specific project, which is only one aspect of energy development in Canada. I certainly think that it is worth continuing to explore. You've heard the Premier of Alberta talk about a national energy framework. There's been discussions among some of the premiers, this is one of those things, again, I'll come back to one of the comments I made earlier. In order for us to have a discussion about energy, we also have to talk about the environment. We absolutely also have to talk about the economy. How do these things all interact? And how do we have the energy resources that we have in abundance here in Canada, that we are endowed with? How is that development undertaken to the benefit of the country, not just one particular region or not just one particular stakeholder group? How is that done? Now, having said that, obviously the devil's in the detail in something like that and getting everybody together. But as an aspirational statement, that's a reasonable approach to take.
At this point, we'd like to, throw it open for some questions from the floor. Yes, sir.
I'm Ron Mannix, Coral Holdings from Calgary. We're at an incredible point in time of change, development. Everybody knows the statistics, how important Asia is. Asia needs energy, we need to develop, etc. The fundamental thing we need to do here and how to do it is we need to change the conversation. In terms of the energy business, you need to change the conversation away from confrontational about the environment and the focus on the environment, and actually there, Brian, taking people up to the oil sands won't change that. You've already convinced the Canadian Council people that know about it and everything. Them looking at a mine isn't going to help. We have to change the conversation. David, with great respect to you and the Native people, money isn't going to change the problem of the Native people. You have to heal your people. In many ways, and money can help maybe get resources to do that, but money and just the property rights isn't going to change it. You need to change the conversation. This conference, can change the conversation to a different way of communicating four things. And this is how you do it. It's the science that is most important about the entire environmental issue. Science is so complicated, so sophisticated, the scientists themselves have lost their ability to communicate what the hell they actually do. And there should be no debate in this room about the environmental issue and the science around the environmental issue. We need to get the best scientists in the world with the very best capability to protect the environment in every way, shape, or form, and then you've got to communicate it. So first you need the science. The second thing, once you have the science and you have used organizations to be able to communicate the very best science in the world, we can develop the policy, whatever the policies are for whoever and for all Canadians. After you have developed the policy, then you have to start applying what those policies, the objectives, etc., are, and develop it, and the energy business in spades can put that in place. And then finally, we need to be able to communicate all of this to the public. We in Alberta, with the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, go on site wherever you want in 3 years have been able to do exactly what I'm talking about. We have changed the policy on a healthcare basis about early childhood development and how that leads to addictions of all type in your adult life, and quietly, low-key in many ways. The confrontational approach that is being taken with Enbridge, and Enbridge screwed it up, I agree with you completely, David. Kinder Morgan's got at least the right approach. Let's go and talk about this stuff. But we need to get the science first that then gets well articulated and put into the policy, and the policy then applied, and all of that communicated. We've got all 4 parts. We'll show you the model, and it's in Alberta today.
I'm not sure there was a question there, but you can respond. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, when you started out on the discussions on healing, reminded me of a story about we had the land, you had the Bible, and now we've got the Bible and you've got the land. No, we're interested in more than just money. What the message is that there has to be sharing. We have to be involved in the planning. We have to be involved in the decision-making process, and that we have to be involved in sharing the benefits that accrue from the exploitation of the resource. And of course we're concerned about the environment. We should be. And some of our people are some of the best scientists in the world, so it cannot be exclusively Western science that dominates the decision process. You go out and talk to those elders. Look at when that ferry hit the rocks off Hartley Bay. Who saved those people? It was those people in that small little village that went out in their little skiffs and fishing boats and dragged all the people off that ferry. And there's no presence in the coast. The federal government has been shutting down a lot of the lighthouses, and that, so safety is a real issue on the West Coast. Why aren't we addressing that? Training opportunities for that. Why aren't we talking about more marine parks? I mean, Mr. Prentice knows about the concerns with respect to the people on the coast about protecting the marine environment. I mean, he did one of the best agreements ever done with the Haida. Why can't we have more of those discussions happening up and down the coast about protecting the marine life and assuring these people that they're going to be able to continue to eat from the ocean as they've done for centuries? And why can't we be talking about the National Energy Strategy? We had the Premier of Alberta, as soon as she made the announcement, we fired a letter off to her. And we said, Premier, bang on. We want to be part of that conversation. We would like to meet with you to talk about a national energy strategy. And then what happened, BC and Alberta got into some conflict, and so therefore she had to write us back and saying, I'm sorry, but given the politics in BC, I cannot meet with you. But we've got this group here now talking about an energy strategy and how we move that forward. We're prepared to talk about a national energy strategy. We're prepared to come to the table with ideas and, yes, solutions as to how we can resolve a lot of these issues.
Brian, I want to give you a chance to respond because Mr. Mannix mentioned bringing people up to the oil sands and the limited impact that might have.
Yeah, and I think what I need to clarify is that certainly is not the only thing that we've been doing as an industry in terms of the point I was trying to make is that anyone that I know of who's actually taken the time to actually understand the facts and actually see firsthand what's being done has a different view after they've got that information, after they've got the facts. And I agree with you, Ron. I mean, the science is important for everyone to understand. You know, the fact of the matter is that there isn't a confrontational approach that's being taken. As industry, the CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, we are absolutely engaged now and have been for some time in terms of discussions with various stakeholder groups to see if we can establish how, and again it's how as opposed to whether or not resources get developed. And we have to take that into consideration. One of the issues you run into, though, is how do you establish that in a time frame that is realistic and one that actually allows us to move forward on a basis when the opportunities are there.
Wenran, just dovetailing off what Dave was talking about, the national energy strategy concept, and Brian mentioned it as well. What do you think of that? I mean, how do you actually design one that's not just some big, mushy motherhood thing, that actually means something, without scaring a lot of people like the NEP did 32 years ago?
Well, there's a lot of conversation about this issue going on already. I mean, if you look at the dynamics now, this country does, as Kevin mentioned, does need fresh ideas, does need some vision, either public corridor on infrastructure or broader conversation on how we deal with the broader diversification. It has to happen. Okay, so if we, looking back at very short Canadian history, well, 19th century were linked with the Europeans, settling here, getting started. 20th century really is a shift to be linked with the United States. I think 21st century, we're facing the next big thing. Are we going to shift to Asia as we discussed, and how do we do that? So we are at that kind of a historical, monumental moment, and then we need thought leaders, opinion leaders, and corporate government leaders, like people like in this room. But I don't see that we're moving really in a direction. I see the federal government is kind of lukewarm. You see some initial conversation going on, and then you got into almost an inter-provincial fight between BC and Alberta. I mean, there are political agendas in different levels out there. They're clear. Let's be realistic. These things will happen in a democracy. But I think the issue here, which I want to go back to the earlier opening statement here, is that there are some things that going beyond the Canadian mindset, narrowly defined insecurity, that we can do to look beyond the Canadian market, to look beyond the Canadian borders, like to deal with the China not only as an opportunity, Asia, others, India, Indonesia, not only as emerging markets, but also emerging issue areas that Canada, as a relatively mid-power, small-power country, can play a positive role in affecting, in influencing the course of their development. We have been talking about how these opportunities will shape us otherwise, this and that. What about what we can do to shape the development of those countries? But back in the 1990s, Paul Evans sitting there with others, we actually helped the Chinese to come into more of a multilateral diplomacy. We used to do that for them. Today, can we engage China in the bigger environmental issues? Because we withdraw from Kyoto saying, well, if we stop living tomorrow, for the entire Canada, we only matter for 2% of CO2 emissions, 23% out of China. If China has to do something, the question now we should ask is what we can do to engage China in that conversation to reduce the CO2 emissions from there. So these are the conversations I would like to see, not just market access, but the global visions that Canada buys into, the good values, the environmental protection issues that you mentioned, the climate change issues, that could be a part of our engagement. At the end of the day, I think we should be strong and clear in saying our engagement agenda with China on the energy front is integrated and indispensable part of our engagement with the environment part of it. And we need to have that national conversation.
You know, I know there are a couple other questions out here. I think I'll get to you in the back, but Jim, did you have a question?
Well, thank you. I think it's been a very interesting discussion with four Canadians who are all well known as experts in their respective disciplines. My name was referenced, and I've never been able to resist that kind of temptation. But I think it is worth reflecting. Dave is one of the most senior people in the First Nations in this country, and I think it's worth reflecting on some of what he has said here today. I know he's not speaking definitively for First Nations here on this panel, but I think the point's been made that it's understood that we need West Coast access, but that there are a couple of things that haven't happened yet. Firstly, there has been no discussion between the First Nations and anyone about what the environmental West Coast co-management regime is going to look like for tanker traffic. And that's a discussion that First Nations are still waiting for. Hasn't happened. That's one thing I took from what Davis said. The other thing is that it's very difficult to, and I don't intend to opine on Enbridge in my comments at all, but clearly from the perspective of First Nations, any linear corridor to the West Coast that involves West Coast access is going to have to deal with the very difficult issues of revenue sharing, profit sharing, access. It's going to have to go beyond accommodation into some sort of, or beyond consultation into some sort of accommodation. And again, I think we're hearing that not a refusal to have that discussion, but a willingness to.
Nancy?
Thank you. I would just like to follow on Jim Prentice's comments, and it struck me all afternoon. Everybody on the panel has agreed, and I believe everybody in this room has agreed, that we need to open up more access to markets, and Pacific Asia Rim is absolutely where we should be looking. But I couldn't agree with Jim's assessment more. For me, today, it felt like we have the cart before the horse. When I was very struck by the compelling discussion that Andre gave us about taking time to develop relationships and build trust, to have true partnerships that can move you forward in a new land, as you're pioneering the exploitation of enterprise in new and varied soils. And it struck me that's exactly what we need to have here in Canada with our First Nations. And Dave, I would just like to ask you, because I and the ATCO group are true proponents of true partnerships, not necessarily entitlement payments or royalties, but real equity partnerships where we both create real value for each other. And I wonder for you, on behalf of the First Nations people, if that would go a long ways to satisfying what you're looking for, or is it something different that is totally constitutionally based that needs to be rectified? Or can we move forward in a business-like fashion with real partnerships?
Yeah, I don't think we have to revisit the Constitution. The Constitution is already clear in Section 35 with respect to the recognition of our rights. What I think I would like to encourage here today is to invite industry to start a conversation with our leadership and to start to put some of these issues on the table and start building partnerships. I mean, right now, the folks in the mid-coast, they're looking at the energy needs, because when we look at these LNG plants, we don't have the energy capacity in British Columbia to be able to fire up those plants. Even with Site C at 1,100 megawatts, it's only like a quarter of the amount that we'll need. So we need to look at the private sector with respect to independent power production. We need to look at how the First Nations are going to engage, and the First Nations are having a conversation amongst themselves in that part of the world with respect to developing a First Nations utility that then can engage in purchasing power from the private sector and then having a relationship, a commercial relationship with BC Hydro. These are some of the ideas I think that we've got to seize on to make these things a reality. And as I said earlier, the Haisla are committed and engaged on the gas front. They've worked out agreements with some of the major proponents. They are now preparing their town, their village, to be able to accommodate this development. They've made that decision. And we've got now First Nations along the right-of-way who have bought in as equity owners of one of the lines. I think there is a real clear agenda there. And I think we need the leadership from this room and then from our community to come together to start to have those conversations. And then I think, as I said earlier, once I think industry and First Nations leaders have defined a comfort zone and have agreed on an agenda, I think then we could bring public governments to the table to ask them to play a role. And as well, the recipients of the resource at the other end should have an obligation as well to look at capacity funding, to look at an economic opportunities fund, and to look at direct investment.
You know, we only have about 5 minutes left. Can you make your comment
It'll be
quick,
fast.
Kevin? And then I want to get to a few more questions around the room quickly before we start.
No, I mean, just picking up on Dave, I mean, to a certain extent, this is indicative of we're having too many partial conversations on something that actually is too important to have partial conversations on. So we're not framing the issue in the way that kind of meets everybody's needs. That's not suggesting what the answer is, but the frame has to be more inclusive. We're not doing that. You know, one of the great powers of government is the power to convene, and we seem to be having some convening issues in this, and therefore that's why I think governments, particularly the national government, the federal government, can play a role in this. I also think there's a conversation, though, that should involve Canadians from coast to coast. This isn't just about energy in BC and Alberta. Energy in BC and Alberta is probably the vanguard of opening up very long-term and very deep trade, investment, and other links with Asia, but it's not the only thing. And we've got to make sure that small and medium-sized enterprises in Ontario and Quebec and elsewhere see the potential in kind of an Asian market the same way as they saw the potential in the American market for goods and services as well as energy. And so we've got to broaden the conversation in many ways, I think.
I'm sorry, you've been waiting patiently. I don't know your name.
That's fine. Brenda Kenny, I'm president of the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association.
Yeah.
I do represent both Enbridge and Kinder Morgan, but I won't be speaking to those specific comments. But I appreciate the discussion. I think it's been extremely helpful. And I guess a quick observation and then a question. The observation is that throughout the course of history of energy in this country, we have managed to move forward on infrastructure when and where we've needed it, generally speaking. Federal government fell over the pipeline debate for whether or not Western gas needed to come to the east. And in the wake of the oil embargo, we had a federally sponsored pipeline built to connect Montreal. So we're faced now with a pretty strong consensus in this room that West Coast access is important to the nation. Rail is certainly a stopgap measure, but I think, Dave, you'd agree, too, that it doesn't resolve the fundamental issues, and it certainly doesn't resolve the safety and environmental concerns and interests. The question I have is, while these bigger sort of coalition questions and discussions do take place, can we find a way to respect the existing institutions, in particular the current hearing of the National Energy Board, which, back to Mr. Mannix's question, is in fact science-based, is designed to evaluate and rigorously tear apart evidence and test whether or not that particular proposal is safe and environmentally sound. And certainly our facts would point to these pipelines are nothing miraculous, and we're among the best in the world in building them here in Canada.
I think that Brenda's made a very important point, and that's that, yes, if we all agree that maybe there needs to be a bigger discussion that has to occur because we are talking about decades of growth opportunities and decades of opportunities. How do we facilitate that and at the same time not come to a grinding halt on existing projects? So existing projects, and one of the things that I would say is there's been a tremendous amount of effort that the federal and provincial governments have been putting into a variety of regulatory processes to improve those processes and have them very effective today. So, I see that as being one of the challenges and in a positive way in terms of maybe looking bigger picture and longer term, but also how do we continue to move forward today on very important developments today which make a big impact in terms of the Canadian economy today and Canadian jobs today.
I've got the wrap-up signal, but Raymond, you had a question. Maybe you could finish up here.
It's more a few comments than a question. Listening to the presentation so far during the day and talking about the main countries of Asia, I'd like to come back to what Mr. Jiang has said about China. I just came back from China a couple of days ago, and I think you're right in putting it to the very strategic level. What is the government's view of China? Is China a friend of Canada, an adversary of Canada, or enemy of Canada. I think there is a contradiction in what our foreign minister says, because he showed up in China describing China as a friend, and now we have the CSIS view describing China as an enemy. I think it's absolutely important to define this, because from that decision will flow the more immediate decision of what to do about the CNOC-Nexon deal. Constantly in China, I was not there for that purpose, but I was asked that question. Mr. Ukraine, what do you think will happen? My answer was the following, even though I have absolutely nothing to do with the government these days. I said, listen, I think that for the government to say no at this stage would put back the relationship a couple of years ago. The Chinese government would not appreciate, would not forgive, would not forget. And also, I don't think that our Prime Minister would have showed up in Vladivostok to sign an investment protection agreement to say no a couple of weeks or months later to the Nexon deal. So these are some comments that I think should be made. Also, in my experience, many times in my career in the foreign affairs, we had to go to cabinet with a deal involving a country like, let's say, Saudi Arabia or Iraq, selling them 3,000 trucks versus their poor human rights record. 90% of the time, the economic arguments win over the rest. The rest in terms of China being the fact that it's a communist country, they don't have the same value, they don't respect human rights, but in the end it counts less than a hard economic interest for Canada. And then, Mr. Porter, you'll be interested to know that, to my great surprise, all SOEs in China mentioned to me the need to deal with First Nations, not through provincial governments, directly. So I don't know what it'll mean for you, but I was quite surprised when that comment was made to be said. Certainly reflected their desire to talk to you about the benefits or lack of it of all those projects inside.
All right, well, unfortunately we're out of time, and I'm sorry to those that I left behind with questions on the floor, but in show business you want them wanting more, so we've left you wanting more. But thanks to all of our panelists today. Many thanks for your candor, and I've been told to announce that there is, as you probably know, a reception and dinner on the 4th floor in the Trillium Room beginning at 6, and there are escalators and an elevator to take you up there. Thank you very much to everybody.